This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and it's Saturday, and that means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. Right now, we're still in the pretty early stages of March of the Machine Limited, and today I wanted to do my usual sort of early format 10 cards I got wrong video. This is sort of a follow-up to the set review, which I of course do before the set is available to play. And it's me going back and looking at 10 cards where I think my evaluation was wrong, and I'll explain why I thought they were wrong, and this also helps sort of explain important aspects about the format. So the first one I want to talk about is Marauding Dreadship. I didn't think this would be a card that would make the cut most of the time. And, you know, in the review, the red review video comments, there were a few people who were like, I think you're underrating Marauding Dreadship. And even already then, I mean, I think I replied to some of those and was like, yeah, I might be. You know, because the more I thought about the card, the more I thought I probably underrated it. And then the format came out, played with and against the card, and it is in fact a nice common. It's not insane or anything, but it's certainly playable. It makes the cut in a lot of red decks. It's interesting because if you told me that I got a 5-mana 2/2 that makes a 4/1 haste vehicle with crew 2, I would think that card was pretty good. It's just like the way this card was laid out, and you know, the way I first read it, I guess, it just seemed to me, I thought about the bad situations where a 4/1 haste isn't that good of an attacker, and you know, even though in the review I noted, hey, you know, if you have the mana, you can just crew this right away with the incubator. But it turns out that's a more powerful line than I really expected. You can almost sort of look at it as a 5-mana 2/2 that makes a 4/1 with haste when it enters the battlefield. You know, things like that. Like once you start breaking down the card, it's like, okay, you get two pretty real things out of this card for a relatively low cost. You can pay for it in installments. If you're in a deck that's interested in sacrificing for value like black-red, it gives you two things to sacrifice. This has just ended up being a very nice, solid common for red, and is certainly a card I underrated. Next, I want to talk about Seed of Hope. I sort of had this in the same spot as Marauding Dreadship, where I didn't think it would make the cut most of the time. I didn't think it was terrible, but I didn't think it would make the cut most of the time, and that proved to be wrong. This is another one where, you know, when I reviewed it in the set review, and I was like, you know, 1 mana to mill 2, and you can only get a card back from those milled cards. Just doesn't seem that good. Plus, you gain 2 life. And again, people in the comments were like, I mean, I think you know, it's going to be better than you think. And this is another one I was like, you know, when I start thinking about this card as 1 mana, Surveil 2, gain 2 life, draw a card, which isn't quite what it is, but it's pretty close. Because Surveil 2 would allow you to choose not to put some of those cards in the graveyard if you wanted to. But you know, in this case, it makes you put them both in, and you're going to hit a permanent most of the time. There are times where you hit like a land and an instant or whatever, and that doesn't feel great, but it is all right. And then, you know, most of the time, or at least a decent chunk of the time, you can get something pretty real back. This, you know, it's not an amazing card or anything, but I think it ends up being your 23rd, 24th card in a lot of green decks in the format. It's perfectly playable. Again, you know, it's basically 1 mana, gain 2 life, draw a card. Like, even if it just said draw a card like that, I would have thought of it as better than what it sort of reads as. But that is functionally kind of what it's like. You know, there's a small chance you whiff, and there's a decent chance the best thing you're going to get out of it is a land. But that's fine for the cost and the additional effects you get out of it. Next up, I want to talk about Temporal Cleansing. So yeah, this thing has ended up being a very good common for blue, and blue overall seems to be, at least right now, you know, this is a thing that can fluctuate. Right now, it seems to be the best color in the set. There's just so many good commons, like just a mountain of really good blue commons, maybe the best common in the set, on top of, you know, all sorts of other great stuff that's going on with it. And Temporal Cleansing is a card that I, you know, thought was a solid playable, but it's been better than that. And so the reason I didn't think it was going to be amazing or anything is I had a hard time getting behind this sort of, seems sort of clunky sorcery speed time ebb effect. And it's funny because, you know, in a video I've done earlier on this channel in this series where I talked about effects people tend to underrate, I specifically mentioned this kind of effect because people often don't see it as removal, but it is. it is 1-for-1 removal because you replace one of your opponent's future draws with the card that's on the table. And yes, they can get their card back, and if it's an insane bomb or something, that can be a bummer. But it is removal. It does get the job done. It does give you a 1-for-1 trade. And the fact that this has Convoke is a pretty real thing. Like, you end up casting this for a lot less, tapping down creatures who couldn't have attacked into the thing that you want to time ebb to your opponent's library anyway, and then attacking with the things that you still have untapped. And convoking is very easy, especially in blue-red, but this works well in any blue deck. It is a very real removal spell, and one that I happily play like 2 of in most blue decks in this format, as opposed to, sort of a passable card to play in your deck. Next up, there is Render Inert. So, yeah, this is one where, in the set review, I said this one's going to really depend on how effective it is to use this on battles. And, I still felt like the card might be a little bit too narrow to be something that you really wanted to include in all of your decks. And I do think that's still true. I do think this needs a build-around grade, because basically what you need to have happen with Render Inert is you need your opponent, well, not your opponent, but you need your opponent to be defending a battle. And you control whether or not that's the case. And that's something that makes this card better than I sort of thought about it. Because obviously, battles, whether or not they're in your deck. It's not like some of these other narrow effects where you're like, well, I don't really know the contents of my opponent's deck or whether or not it'll work. But you want to use this on your battles most of the time anyway. And if you have 3 or 4 battles, you should be playing Render Inert in your deck. Because when you're able to use it to transform a battle, and it can transform most of them, you end up getting a 2-for-1. And, this has this fail case, like say you don't draw your battles, but your opponent has like an incubator in play or whatever, and you don't really want to use Render Inert on that many of the incubators in the set, because so many of them are just like an additional effect tacked onto a card, so you're not really getting a 1-for-1, but that's the fail case. I would say don't run this if you have like 2 or fewer battles. Once you get to 3, I think you play it, and 4, I think you're always going to play it. That does mean this isn't really a card for aggro decks, because aggro decks in general have been less interested in battles than the more grindy, control-y type decks. So far those are 4 cards, all of which I underrated. Let's move now to one I overrated, which is Invasion of Regatha. So, going into the format, I was pretty high on all the battles, and I do think they've ended up being pretty good collectively. And sort of my rule, even in the set review, and it's still sort of how I feel about them, though there's a few exceptions. If a battle adds to the board or subtracts from the board, or it is cheap, it tends to be pretty good. If it can't do those things, it tends to not be so good. And part of the problem with Invasion of Regatha is that it's sort of an aggressive card, and even though red-green is sort of a battle deck, it's not really like an aggro deck. It's like a mid-range value deck that gets value out of these battles, and that is where Invasion of Regatha can work. But I thought this was going to be a really good battle. I like the idea of hitting other battles with it, which you can. And, it's sort of like Render Inert in that way, in that, it can help you defeat a battle, but the difference between it and Render Inert is Render Inert always replaces itself. This does not. The times where you do 4 to your opponent or to a battle and ping something feel great, and those do happen, but they don't happen enough. This card ends up not really doing enough a significant chunk of the time. It burns your opponent, and thus it is something that would be good in like an aggressive deck, but aggressive decks don't really want battles. So it ends up being in sort of an awkward spot. I don't think it's terrible or anything, but I thought it was going to be like a card you take really highly in the draft, and it just isn't. Next, let's talk about Preening Champion. You might be surprised to see this one here, if you watched my set review or my video earlier in this series where I just talked about the best commons and uncommons in the set, because I gave this a very good grade, especially for a common, and I said it was Blue's best common in the set review, or in the best commons and uncommons video, and those things have turned out to be true, but it's even better than I expected it to be. This isn't a hard card to predict is going to be good in limited. This kind of card always is. You get 2 bodies for 3 mana. One of them's a Windrake. We see this card. We've seen variations on this card many times. Sometimes there's a creature on the ground that makes a 1/1 flyer. Whatever it is, you pay 3 mana, you get 2 bodies. There's some flying in there and some decent stats. That's always good in limited. But this has been even better. Convoke plays a big role in that. The fact is, like, sometimes the turn you play this, if you have a Convoke card in your hand, you immediately sort of can get 2 mana back from casting Preening Champion. Like, if you have your Temporal Cleansing ready to go, you can cast this. If you have a couple other mana or another creature or whatever lying around, you can cast this and then also use Temporal Cleansing in the same turn. And that's like a common, those are 2 commons, 2 blue commons. It happens all the time. And that's super powerful. And it's also a knight, which matters for the blue-white deck. So, between being just like a really good body for the cost, just being great on rate, which is sort of the grade I gave it going into the set, it has a bunch of extra value associated with it that make it Blue's best common by far, and might just be the best common in the set. It's certainly in the conversation, and I probably wouldn't have predicted that going into I didn't predict that going into the format, just that it would be a really good common. Best common in the set is like a whole other level. Next up, we've got Tetsuko Umazawa. So this is from the bonus sheet. I gave this a grade based on what it was back in, I guess it was original Dominaria. That's what it was. The set called Dominaria. And, it was fine there. It was a 2-mana 1/3 that was unblockable a lot of the time. And there were a few other cards in your deck it might make unblockable. But this ends up being significantly better than I expected in this format. Battles are part of the reason for this. This makes your creatures evasive so they can hit battles easier. And, in the blue-white deck especially, there are several 1 toughness creatures who you just play in the deck. The most notable of these is the Swordsworn Cavalier, I think it is, a 2-mana 3/1 that gets first strike when a knight enters the battlefield. That thing being unblockable is a huge problem for your opponent and can quickly close out games just, with that combination of, cards that are at lower rarities. And there's a bunch of other cards in other colors too, but that's the combo I kind of feel like you see the most. It works really well in the blue-white knight deck. There's just a bunch of things that it makes unblockable. So, I thought it was an okay card, but I think it's, a little bit on the higher end now in terms of like uncommons in the set. It's not like, anywhere close to the best uncommon or even the best blue uncommon in the set or anything, but it is really good, and I expected it to just be okay. Next up, there is Blighted Burgeoning. This is sort of like Marauding Dreadship. I thought this would be fine. I thought it would be better than the Dreadship. I gave the Dreadship a really low grade. The Blighted Burgeoning, I gave a grade that meant, you'll play it, especially if you need fixing or whatever, which is true. But this is another card that gives you 2 things, and the 2 things you get out of it are pretty real. In the set review, I specifically noted, hey, if you play this on an untapped land, you can leave that land untapped, to bluff things and then transform the thing it made right away. And, this is something I noticed in the review, but I didn't fully realize until playing with and against it how good that can be, and it definitely is. The format has overall trended towards sort of value grindy decks being, at their best. There are definitely some tempo decks like blue-white that can get in under these grindier decks, but it turns out that this sort of fixing, and this is, in some formats this would probably be a little bit too clunky, but it is a source of fixing that adds to the board, and those always tend to end up being pretty good. And this has ended up being a much more important green common than I imagined it would be. I thought it would be sort of a, you're going to run it if you are in need of fixing, in desperate need of fixing especially. But, even if you're just splashing something, this is definitely worth playing. I still wouldn't really play this card in a deck that isn't trying to play multiple colors. You need to be able to get full value out of both halves of it. If you don't, it's a lot less impressive. But the thing is, most decks in this format, you are splashing a 3rd color a lot of the time, so it ends up working out. Next, let's talk about Invasion of Belenon. Like the other battle on this list, this is a card that I overrated. My rule, like I said, if I'm going to be as succinct as possible, is just if a battle costs 2 mana or it impacts the board, it's worth playing in limited. And this one meets that second requirement. It does impact the board. It gives you a 2/2 vigilance for 3 mana. That creature even has a useful creature type. There's a lot going on here. When you can attack it down, you end up getting a battle out of the deal, an anthem out of the deal, rather. And all of that seemed pretty good, but there's, a weird tension here that makes this card awkward. And that is mostly that white decks in this format don't really, most of them, really, don't want to play battles. The white decks in the format are some of the more aggressive tempo-y ones that are trying to get under the decks that are playing battles, and you don't really want to be throwing away damage you could do to your opponent by attacking battles. So it ends up just not really working out well. Like if you're in a blue-white deck, if you're in the night deck, you basically have no interest in attacking this because you just want to put your opponent in a spot where you're just bouncing and tapping down their blockers and attacking them before they can ever get their feet underneath them. And if you take a turn off to attack this to get the anthem, sure, your creatures are going to be bigger, but they're going to outvalue you because of that extra turn you basically gave them, and their creatures are still going to be more impressive than yours once you reach the later stages of the game. And so it ends up being really awkward. I mean, there are other battles, white battles that are better, like Invasion of Dominaria. This is one that doesn't actually impact the board, but in the grindier decks, the fact that it just gains you life and draws you a card, and then you can transform it in the later part of the game, like that ends up working out pretty well. But this battle, trying to make you think that attacking it is good for your aggressive strategy, like that's kind of what it's trying to tell you. It just isn't. You basically don't want to be attacking this battle in most situations in the decks that it is trying to be part of. So, I wouldn't say never play it, I guess, in a night deck, but you probably can find some better playables in that kind of deck, and, you're more interested in playing it in some other type of white deck than you are, blue-white or something like that. And then the last card, it's another blue card with Convoke. It's Artistic Refusal. Clearly I underrated Convoke a little bit. That's and blue, I guess, because Artistic Refusal, Preening Champion, and Temporal Cleansing are all better than I think they are because of Convoke, basically. And yeah, this is too. I didn't love the idea. It's hard to look past the fact that this costs 6 mana, even if it has Convoke. It's hard to look past that. It was hard for me in the set review to be like, yeah, I mean, sure, maybe I'll get it down to 4 or 5 mana, but that just doesn't seem like enough to me. But it turns out, first of all, that it is often worth it, especially at 4. It doesn't feel that far from Cryptic Command, which I know sounds crazy, but countering a spell, drawing 2, and discarding 1 is like a big deal in Limited. And so you end up being able to pay 4 for this. It feels great. Sometimes your board is built out enough that you can do it with very little actual mana untapped, sometimes without any mana untapped, and it does really swing the game in your favor when you cast it. It still has the problems all cards like this do. Like, it is not good early. That keeps it from being a great card by any stretch. It just doesn't do anything in the early game, basically. And there are times where, trying to hold this up and counter something becomes a bad idea, especially if you're up against a more aggressive deck. Having Artistic Refusal in your hand does not feel good. But the good news is lots of decks in this format aren't those sorts of decks. And once you're in these sort of grindy mirror matches, Artistic Refusal can really break the game when you counter some big haymaker your opponent was going to play and net a card out of the situation. It just feels amazing. So it's ended up being like a card I always want one of in blue decks that basically aren't the night deck, but even in that deck, it's not completely terrible. But basically all the other blue decks want one of these, and it does a lot of work. So those are the 10 cards that right now I know I've got wrong. There'll be more for me to talk about as we, once I've really gone deep on this format, 50, 60 drafts or whatever. As usual, at the end of the format, I'll do a retrospective where I dive into all the cards I got wrong, which is usually more than 10. And we'll see where things end up there. For now, let's do a crack a pack, which means I'll show you a pack one, pick one scenario, talk about the cards in the pack, and tell you, how I feel about those cards, and then what card I would first pick. All right, so here is our pack. Our first common is Pyretic Prankster. This is an okay 2-drop. It has sort of dropped for me. But 2 drops are always something you need. It's a solid card. I thought it would be a little better, maybe not so much. It's not so much better or worse than I expected that it quite makes this list, but I did think it was going to be a little better than it is. Once it transforms, its ability to make your opponent sacrifice can be a real problem, but neither body is a huge deal. It's just a solid 2-drop. Certainly not something you want to first pick. Our Multiverse Legend is Rona, Shieldred's Faithful. This is okay. If you're in the blue-black deck, especially, running her is fine. She ends up in your graveyard in that deck a lot, and then you can get her back later in the game. You also tend to run enough spells that her ability matters, but she's nothing special, really. And not really, it's not like you're in the blue-black deck and you really desperately want Rona. she's more like a card that you'll play if you're in the blue-black deck, and, that's... So she's not something that you're really after. As far as Dispersal's next, this has ended up being good. I thought it would be in the set review. That's why it wasn't on this list. This is a blue common that I got right. It is quite good. The Surveil tacked onto the effect is nice. How cheap it is for tapping or bouncing tapped creatures is really good. And while Surveil isn't quite drawing a card, like, you get close to it, you're still going down a card for tempo when you use a card like this most of the time. You can use it, of course, in response to tricks, which is really backbreaking for your opponent, because then you get tempo and you trade 1-for-1. But the Surveil really improves your draws when it matters. And so yeah, it's a nice common and would be what we're taking right now. I don't really think it's something I would love to first pick here, but it is what we would take right now. Beamtown Beatstick is next. This is, an okay piece of equipment, but I don't really, I've had a couple decks where I tried really hard to push synergy in this format just because that's sort of, I've talked about already in this series. Synergy is not a big deal in this format, and I've tried, various avenues of trying to check that. And to do that, I, have jammed a couple Beamtown Beatsticks into like black-red sacrifice decks where I could get serious value, like Jury, Master of the Review and stuff. And sometimes it lined up and it worked really well, and it did some cool stuff with the, sacrifice payoffs I had, because I had all these treasures and my creature had menace and all this. But there were also lots of times where it was just really awkward. I didn't have a good thing to put it on. Like, even in a deck that is like sort of built around getting advantages out of the treasure, it still didn't really work. So overall, I haven't been that impressed with it, and I certainly don't want to first pick it. Arachnoid Adaptation, I think I said in last week's Crack-A-Pack that I wasn't huge on tricks in this format, and I still think that's kind of true, partly because of things like as far as Dispersal and all the Convoke stuff that people can do in response. Like, people are able to do things in response to you using tricks way more often in this format. But I do think Arachnoid Adaptation, other than there's a couple of white tricks that are better, but other than those, it's probably the best trick in the format just because it's cheap. It gives a good boost for the rate, and it's going to win you combat most of the time if your opponent doesn't have a way to interact. It's just the danger of interaction is higher than usual in the format. Definitely still on as far as Dispersal. Furnace Host Charger, I think these land cyclers are fine. If you're running a deck that's playing multiple colors and you're splashing something powerful, this is one that can help you splash a red card. It's kind of annoying that the black one costs double black, so I hate the idea of using it because you're like never going to cast it. With these, they can both help you splash and then be an okay thing that you're splashing if you have the red mana when you draw it. And I like that ability. I don't find myself running them that much if I'm not, splashing a third color or really interested in getting in as many lands as possible, but they're okay. Definitely still on Dispersal. Tenured Oilcaster is next. Passable, playable, certainly nothing special. I've had some good experiences with it, but it's also not really a card that strikes fear into me when my opponent plays it. Oculus Whelp is our next common. This has such below race stats, and it dies to a bunch of 1-mana removal in the format that even with the upside it has, I haven't loved it. You do get to draw a card with it sometimes, and especially if you're in blue-green, you get to do that. And if you can find a way to do that consistently, it does get better, but it still usually doesn't feel great because of the tempo hit. Bola Slinger's next. I think this is probably our new first pick. This has, I was talking about tempo and all of that. Like, you really want to be just getting blockers out of the way in like a blue-white or a red-white deck and just going after these people who are trying to do silly value things like cast big Convoke spells and transform battles and all of that stuff. And Bola Slinger is the kind of card that enables that. It comes down, it makes one of your things into a much scarier attacker for a turn. Then on the next turn, it attacks as a scary attacker because of its ability. And if you're able to get a couple blockers out of the way and let your board attack more effectively, it can often just end the game. So it is a very good common. It has an impact on the board right when it enters the battlefield. And that means even if your opponent kills it right away, you got value out of it and they can't do anything about it. And if they don't kill it, attacking on a second turn with this attack trigger is often enough to close out a game against the slower decks in the format, which is basically the majority of decks in the format. So I would take it over as far as Dispersal. I do think blue is a better color than white overall, but I think Bola Slinger is a better card than Dispersal overall. Vengeant Earth is next. This is not good. no big surprise there. Just, you know, we see this card all the time. This has some extra wrinkles in it that could have changed things up. You know, you can use it not only to animate a land, but you can use it to augment a creature or whatever. You know, using it on an incubator can be kind of funny, but there's still, it's still too situational. It still does something for one turn that often doesn't impact the board. The lure effect on it is cute, but still too situational. So, you know, you don't want to take this first or play it really in the format. There aren't that many cards that I would say don't play like full stop in the format, but it is one of them. Converter Beast, this is fine. It's another one of these cards. It gives you 2 bodies. The second body it gives you can be quite large, you know, once you get it going. There are times where it's kind of a bummer where you pay 4 for this 0/1 and your opponent is just like, whatever, I attack with everything and you're dead. But, you know, most of the time, these decks in green where you're like getting value out of your incubators and stuff, you can buy yourself the time to get that 5/5, which can usually slow them down. So still on Bola Slinger. We've got Artistic Refusal next. So we talked about this already. It's really good. And I do think it's the second best card in the pack. I think I would take it after Bola Slinger, but I do think Bola Slinger is a better card. It's a common, and part of the reason for that is that Artistic Refusal really, like I said, isn't especially good early. It doesn't do anything early. It's not really even a card you want to see that much in your opening hand. That's why I say I don't really want to play more than one, you know, in my blue decks. But it does have a big effect. Like it has a higher ceiling. Well, that may not even be true because Bola Slinger's ceiling is your opponent doesn't block 2 turns in a row and they're dead. And Artistic Refusal's ceiling is you counter a thing and get a 2-for-1, which is a good ceiling, but not quite as high as Bola Slinger's. So, and the Slinger might have a higher floor too. So I think I'm in on the Slinger still. We do have the Blue-Red Signpost uncommon, which is the Convoke payoffy one that gives you 3 bodies, and you get to do 1 to your opponent and battles they're protecting when you cast a Convoke spell. It is really good. You know, no surprise. The blue Convoke thing has really worked out in the format. So it shouldn't be a surprise that this card is really, really good. And I do think it's enough better than Bola Slinger or Artistic Refusal for me to take it here. It does, you know, have a big impact on the board. Adding 3 bodies to the board is always going to be quite impactful. Like even if you're behind, whether you're behind at parity or ahead, it ends up being really impactful. And then the extra stuff it has going on is really good. It is a gold card, so our chances of playing it are lower, but I do think it's better than Bola Slinger overall, so I think we go for it. This is a very Convoke-y pack, the last 3 cards in general, because our rare is Invasion of Segovia, the blue battle that is basically all about Convoke. The front side gives you 2 1/1 trampling Krakens, which is funny. And then it transforms into a thing that gives your stuff Convoke and allows you to untap creatures so you can leave Convoke stuff up a little more effectively. I think Invasion of Segovia and Joyful Storm Sculptor are pretty close. You know, they're both like Convoke enablers / build-arounds. And the biggest difference to me is that Invasion of Segovia is 1 color and a lot cheaper, so it'll slot into more decks than just the blue-red deck. I mean, splashing's a thing in this format, don't get me wrong, and so you can splash the Sculptor pretty easily, but if you still have the opportunity to take a mono blue card that is maybe, I think it's probably even a little better than Storm Sculptor, it ends up being pretty good, you know, and this is one that follows the rules, right? It adds to the board when you play it, and the fact you get those 2 1/1s really matters. You can set up Convoke stuff with it, you know, you can cast your Temporal Cleansing so that you can attack it on another turn and get things going. So I like Invasion of Segovia a lot. You know, it's great to get a blue rare in the format, with blue being as strong as it is, and the invasion is quite good. So I think we take the rare in the end here, which is, you know, what you end up doing in a lot of packs in this format. So, all right, that'll do it for this week. I think next week I'll come back with my archetype rankings, you know, talking about each of the color pairs, how good I think they are, whether or not I think they can be successful consistently in the format and stuff like that. So I'll see you for that video. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including a bunch of draft videos, my set review, you should see the playlist for those on the screen shortly. Thanks for watching.